giving resuscitation. So this near-death experience that Dinesh thinks is so wonderful for evidence, and that's his only evidence, by the way, and we have to discount the stories of the New Testament as evidence. Those are just stories, and I can go into greater depth on that. Does that say 2 minutes? Is that what this is? Okay. So during rebuttal, I will even amplify why near-death experiences are a bad. In fact, near-death experiences themselves are counterproductive. Near-death experiences, when you look at all the stories across cultures and across time, lend much more support to the hypothesis that what's happening in a dying brain is a hallucination is happening. Hallucinations in a dying brain happen. It would be like saying, and I know dreams are different, but if suppose we uncovered a commonality among all of our dreams, the fear of falling, let's say, or something. We find that people have dreams and there's commonalities. Does that mean, therefore, that those things that we dream about are actual, real things? Near-death experience is not an evidence for the afterlife. And we are living our afterlives now. We should make the best of it. And the fact that life is not eternal, I think, enhances the quality of life. If life is eternal, then life is cheap. We give more value to things that are rare and precious. We give more value to things. When a child dies, we think it's a greater loss than when an old person dies. They're both tragedies, but when things are a precious metal or a gold or something that's rare, its value goes up. So if life is eternal, then life is worthless. It's cheap. It's nothing. I mean, who wants it if it's just some soul kissing the feet of some dictator who says, I created you for my glory, therefore you should glorify me. I mean, who wants that? Don't you want to live your own life? Make your own decisions, make your own mistakes, experience your own consciousness in your own body, given to you by your parents through a physical process, through a physical development, in a natural environment. This afterlife that we are living right now is the only one we're ever going to have, and it's a wonderful afterlife, and let's make the best of it.
Whenever I debate Dan, I always feel like I'm a little bit like I'm at a rodeo. I see a point here, I see a point there, but a lot of bull in between. Now, Dan professes to be a skeptic, an open-minded inquirer. And for him, you would think the topic of life after death would be one similar to investigating his life on other planets. There may be, there may not be, there might be some evidence, it may work, it may not work. But I think you began to see, if you listen to him carefully, a certain kind of gritty determination to debunk life after death. That's a little unnatural. In other words, toward the end, you got the sense that he doesn't want there to be life after death. That's why he said it's better if there isn't. Who wants to kiss the feet of a dictator? In other words, the point I want to get at is, Dan has become alienated from the Christianity he was raised in. He's bitter against it. He hates the idea of a God who's in charge of moral judgment, of heaven, of hell. He has a wish fulfillment that that not be the case. And so his arguments, presented, if you will, as the neutral face of reason, are actually, if you will, willfully deployed with an agenda. And I think that began to be clear without rebuttal, just in his own remarks itself. To him, it would be really bad if there was life after death. So it's not an open-minded inquiry for him at all. The philosopher A.J. Ayer, A-Y-E-R, one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century, the leader of a movement called logical positivism, an atheist, had a near-death experience. And here's what he said. He said, I saw a bright light. He said, I felt I was in a realm where, quote, the laws of nature had ceased to function. He said, I felt there was a presence of someone who was responsible for the government of the universe. And then he came back to consciousness. And here's what happened. He remained an atheist. But he said, I now have strong evidence that death does not put an end to consciousness. In other words, the atheist does not believe in God, but he does believe in life after death based upon his own experience. Now, atheists are always saying, give us data. Now, with near-death experiences, we're not talking about one case. He ends up rebutting a case I didn't even bring up. We have tens of thousands of cases, multiple books and scholarly studies, a whole society devoted to studying the subject that takes it seriously, psychologists, neurobiologists, and for Dan to simply say they're hallucinations, I think reflects a certain kind of intellectual unseriousness. Here's why. First of all, we can have hallucinations, but hallucinations are private, like dreams. Imagine if we all came in this room and we have dreams, that's normal. But what if all of us, all 500 or 600 of us here, last night had the same dream? That would be creepy. That would suggest that maybe this is not a mere hallucination, that something is going on. So when people across cultures have similarities of experience, not identical, but similarities, that tells you that this is something you have to investigate further. The leading critic of near-death experiences, the psychologist Susan Blackmore, I'm going to quote her for a moment. She says that universally, there are multiple features of the near-death experience, and any good theory must explain these features. She says it's not enough to say that these are mental states. You have to show why these states, why tunnels, why bright lights, where does all the feeling of love and warmth, where does the experience of celestial beings, why that experience? Now, Susan Blackmore has her own theory, which Dan kind of echoed, the dying brain hypothesis, which seemed very original when she first made it in 1978, I believe. Here's the problem with the dying brain hypothesis. The idea is very simple, by the way. As the brain fades down, it's kind of like turning off the ignition in the car, and it generates special effects. And since we all have brains, maybe these special effects have certain similarities. But here's the problem. Where are the people who have had near-death experiences? Where are these tens of thousands of people? The answer is, they're living among us. They drive to work, we see them on the highway, they show up at the office. So if you're telling me their brains have died and undergone this shutdown experience, how have all their brains reconstituted themselves, repaired themselves so that they're now able to function normally? The dying brain hypothesis cannot account for the obvious fact that these tens of thousands of people all have normal brains as we speak. Now, Dan says, what is a soul? And here he engages in this sort of crude materialism where if something doesn't have a physical identity, it doesn't exist. I might just as well say, what is love? What is democracy? What is rights? Can you show me a right? Can you identify it, weigh it, smell it, touch it? No, therefore rights they don't exist. It doesn't follow. Just the fact that we don't give a material embodiment to concepts doesn't mean that they don't have, that immaterial things can't exist. I would say the soul is the moral faculty. It is simply the faculty of telling right from wrong. Now, the philosopher Socrates, a long time ago, said that we're made up of two kinds of stuff, physical stuff, organs, arms, and mental stuff, thoughts, feelings, morality. He said clearly when we die, the physical part of us does break down. We know that. No one disagrees about that. But he said the other stuff, the immaterial stuff, is different. It doesn't have an expiration date. It lives on. This was Socrates' argument for life after death, by the way, not made on religious grounds. Dan made a very interesting statement. Consciousness, he said, is dependent on the brain. He wanted you to hear something a little different than that in a sense, consciousness is generated by the brain. That without a brain, you can't have consciousness. Now, this, I want to submit, is sheer conjecture. In other words, I don't deny for one moment that we need our brain to manifest consciousness, in the same way that I need my CD player to play music. But does it follow that the music itself is created by the CD player? No, the sound waves are independent of the CD player. They require the CD player to manifest themselves. Or consider my computer. It has hardware, it has software. True, the software programs can't run on their own. They require a frame, they require hardware to run. So think of your mind as software. Think of your brain as hardware. The two go together. The software needs the hardware to manifest itself. But does it follow that the hardware has somehow invented the software? The software is a figment of our imagination? That when the hardware breaks down, the software can't run on a different application? Nonsense. So all neuroscientists know that when you talk about the mind and the brain, you are talking about two different things. They are interdependent, but they are not identical. And as we get into this debate, I would be very happy to examine more closely ways in which the mind and the brain are distinguished one from the other, which opens up the very real possibility that while brains are required for minds to manifest themselves in our lives, there is no reason that these minds cannot, in other manifestations or instantiations, continue even after the physical brain has broken down. Now, what about this idea that the resurrection is... I see my time is up, so I'm going to stop, and I'll be happy to return to this topic in just a moment. Thank you very much.
Software is also physical. Detectives at a crime scene at least know there was a crime. It was a physical thing that happened. Keith Augustine wrote a wonderful essay about near-death experiences which go into greater detail than any that I've ever seen, analyzing all the stories, cross-culturally, across time. And it's called Hallucinatory Near-Death Experiences. And he points out, and I don't have time for all the problems, that among these near-death experiences, they are not uniform. The book, Life After Life, that came out, Raymond Moody back in 1975, came up with a composite of what happens during a near-death experience. He admits it's a composite, but in the popular mind, people think that's what happens to people in near-death experiences. This happens, this happens, this happens, this happens. Actually, only 10 to 20% of people who are clinically dead report coming back with a near-death experience. And only about half of those report anything like an out-of-body experience. Does that mean the other 80% of us are not going to have a life after death? There's only those few people? My former mother-in-law, Wilda was her name, she died. And when she was in the room, she started speaking out about what she was seeing. She saw heaven. She saw Jesus. She saw all these angels. And everybody was going, wow, and she died a few minutes later. And she also saw me welcoming her into heaven. Trouble was, I wasn't dead. A lot of people with near-death experiences report seeing living people who are not dead. This young couple was in a car accident. She was knocked unconscious, and she reported a near-death experience where she was floating to heaven. She was holding her boyfriend's hand, and they were both going through this tunnel together, looking at each other. It was wonderful. The only problem was he wasn't unconscious. He wasn't even near death. She was imagining that her boyfriend was with her. When you look at these stories of near-death experiences and people report what they saw, the discrepancies far outnumber the similarities. People who report things that they saw that didn't happen. People who were not in the room. A woman reported that she was wearing overalls and she wasn't. Getting the colors wrong. Obviously people are guessing. They're building. And the last thing to go when you're dying, by the way, is your hearing. Hearing becomes very acute, and it's natural to want to reconstruct the scene from what you're hearing. Dinesh's wife was hearing what was happening around there, and the brain, when it's hearing things, reconstructs the scene from like a dream-like state. And when you dream, you have a point of view, don't you? When you dream, aren't you seeing it from a certain point of view? If you look at these near-death experience stories, there's so many discrepancies in what people report happened, and when they look and they say, well, that actually didn't happen. Not a single case of a near-death experience happened during the time when a person was actually brain dead. All of them happened during a time when they're under anesthesia or they're getting close. So in the case of Pam Reynolds, for example, she's supposedly the celebrated case of her brain was cooled down to total inactivity and she was able to still have consciousness. No, she wasn't. The things that she reported later were things that happened an hour or two before that. She was in the operating room a long time. And yet